Townhouse. Now, since 1876, this is a family-run auction house and one of the oldest there is. And I've got to say, such pride that it is for me to be here today, because I teach these jewels, and I've been teaching them in Australia, I've been teaching them coast to coast America, and finally I've brought them home. I've brought them back to where they all began. And it's a real reflection for me to have been teaching in so many places and to feel the resonance of what this very city has done for the rest of the planet. All of these jewels you'll see today, or predominantly the majority of them, have their history here. So for me to be presenting in England, which is my first time to be presenting in England, is such an incredible feeling for me. So thank you for coming, it means a hell of a lot to me. It's really lovely. Now, the first thing we need to do whenever we think of a mourning jewel is to think about the human behind it. But remember, humans in our day-to-day and our fashion and who we are defined by the way we look. The way we look is a choice. It's a choice to be a part of culture, it's a choice to be a part of fashion, it's a choice to be who you are in your own identity. And without that choice, it's random, and you don't understand the people around you. So mourning jewelry and its history are very intrinsic to science, politics, economics, technology, and all of the things that humanity really, really cares about, and that's to create a fashion and an identity, and each and every one of you is part of fashion and identity. Because if you see someone crossing the street who looks a lot like you, who presents themselves in the same way as you, you know that you can approach that person. If I'm wearing a mourning jewel, I know that I'm in mourning. If I can see them in mourning, I can appreciate and approach them and say, you know, are you okay? I understand your value system. I understand your religion. All of this is very important to the history of mourning jewelry. But there's also something else humans love even more. It's something that ever since the Tigris met the Euphrates and we could create agriculture, and we had something in a hierarchical sense right up here that someone could provide for people right down there who are growing something. Now that little something is a system, and that one thing that we cannot break free from is money. That's the truth. It's business and economics at the end of the day. So if I see someone who's in mourning and I need to...
Thank you.
And I need to, say, exploit that for the sake of money, because of volume, because of that person within the society, then I can, because they need it. It's the old saying, death and taxes. And mourning jewelry very much fits into all of those paradigms. So if I do talk about business, don't feel bad. It's all still about the human, that center of connecting the mind and the memory to the heart, the jewel. The jewel represents that life. And that's why I teach these things. They are living history. And that living history goes back into deep history. And this particular piece here is from the 3rd century CE. So this is a Roman piece. And this piece here, Remember Me, My Beloved, pulling on the ear, it's been reset in the 18th century, of course. However, as people could have wealth and avarice, they could give back a token of love and appreciation. They could afford it. It's no different for the Romans. They did the same thing. So it's no different for people in the early modern period, which we'll be focusing on today. And as seen here, we've got this piece from, it's around the 14th century. It's a bronze buckle ring. Now it says, let's see if this works. Mother of God, remember me. So the one thing to remember about this piece from that era, so we're looking at about the medieval period, it's all about final judgment. And when we're talking about jewels of death, we have to think about what happens after that person dies. So I'm sure we're all familiar with memento mori, and we've seen those skulls and crossbones and all of the sides and all of the things which show death to be what we see as the desecration of the body. But we're not there yet. A jewel like this says Mother of God. So we're still going under the paradigm of when I'm gone, I'm going on to final judgment. We're Catholics. Remember, religion plays into this piece here. It's very important. But you see also the design with the buckle. You will see this replicated as we get to the 19th century. And then you see the actual ring itself. So there are examples in Chesterfield and Norfolk Castle. And this relates very importantly at the time because of the Great Schism. So we have several popes all vying for someone's certain piety. They are looking for people to look up to them because that's the conduit towards God. So if that's the person you're looking towards, and that person at that time is starting to become corrupt, and there are several popes, which one do I turn to? I always say, think about the values of yourself, and think about the values of yourself at that particular time. Imagine if you were going through a very difficult religious period, the sake of one generation, and all of a sudden, things are changing. We don't have that one conduit towards God, yet I'm a poor worker on a field. I'm working very, very hard to be judged under God. But God's changing, because the conduit towards God's changing. So the identity of death starts to change. It's not overnight, of course, but people start to challenge it. Now, if you see something like this is the earliest recorded mourning ring, and for two simple purposes. Can anyone see what they are? It's these designs here and here. Skulls, thank you very much. Here we have the skulls. We start to show, instead of just showing a religious motif. Remember, so I grew up Catholic. So my nonna, a lot of the imagery she would use when she was passing away was the saints. It was Mary, it was Jesus. Here we're showing the desecration of the body with a love heart in between. So something like that starts to cement itself about the late 15th century. And then when we see this, we start to see that in society people started to change out the fact that they were showing their mortality, and not just showing that under God they would die. And for a person who was learning their father's trade, or their mother's trade, that was what their trade would be. At this time there's no access to easy education, there's no access to easy affluence. We just have to do what we did because that's how we get by. So all of the things which could have produced this at a low mainstream level, at a level where people who weren't very affluent could afford it, didn't exist just yet. But then you see something like this, which is maybe a higher level. This is a variation on pilgrim badge. So something like this shows that people who had the affluence could actually wear something which shows that death wasn't completely uncommon. This is St. John the Baptist, or at least what's left of him, but it still shows what's left of him. And all of these pieces, and this one's from about 1500 to 1520, they weren't divorced from death, obviously, but it's still, the conduit into is still a saint or a religious figure, or God, Jesus Christ, Mary. So that's the mindset of the time. We hadn't yet hit on something very, very important, which was going to happen in 1517, and that changed everything. And that's a good reason of why we're here, actually. Now, on this note, we'll get into Memento Mori and what happened in 1517. So it was on October 31st in Wittenberg that a certain Martin Luther, now the 95 Thesis, or the Disputation of the Power of Indulgences. And this is a challenge to, say, the popes and the secular Catholicism, which has really started to lose faith in what it was to be someone under God. So we don't renounce God, we don't get rid of God, but we have to change our mindset at the time. Now, back to that pilgrim badge for just 1 second. A pilgrim badge, stamped in, lead, pewter, cheap materials, to go on a pilgrimage back in those days was no different, and that comes back to that identity piece. If someone was going from, say, village to village and going to a saintly ordained church or cathedral, they would walk up. This is their big moment. They've left their church. And what's around this church? People selling pilgrim badges. And they would buy them. And they would take them back to their church, and it's a status symbol for them to put that on the church's wall. So the idea that fashion and jewellery are divorced from each other right now just because of piety isn't true. It's that everybody did it, and people always want to buy something. People always want to be fashionable, and it's just about the identity of what we're under. And at that time, we were Catholicism, but now we can move into more of Memento Mori. So here is a clear depiction of a skeleton in the coffin, in situ. We have a beautiful black enamel, and at this time, we've got this pendant being from about 1540 to 1550. And at that short amount of time, we've changed out our value system. We've gone from, the whole idea of religious icons being the things that we were looking up to, and now we're starting to show the desecration of the body. But it's really in this very country where things changed out predominantly. And that's because of the Anglican Church. So the Anglican Church, the Acts of Supremacy between 1534 and 1559, you've got Henry VIII. So now Henry VIII is my conduit towards God. We've got the Anglican Church, but what happened to the popes? And that's where I like to bring it back to stop thinking about this happening over a large body of time, but the span of a lifetime. That lifetime is completely changed out, and that's very shocking. So it's shocking enough that people started to change their understanding of what it was to die. But of course, it wasn't simply about the desecration of the body being, this is what it is. It's all about living a better life. So at this time also, a bit later on, we start to have access to new trade routes, shipping, access to wealth. Things like guilds become a thing, things like schools. So what we can do is we can start to send our children to get educated. They can start to change out their life. They don't have to learn what I learned, and I don't have to teach them. So all of a sudden, a jewel like this means have a better life. It's not just simply, there's the fact of death. It's saying, there's the fact of death, so do better, live better. Memento mori, remember you will die. And this beautiful piece encapsulates that in a glorious way. You can see there's no change to what a glorification of death looks like. Here it is. The skull, the coffin, the skeleton itself. This is very much a literal depiction. It's not romanticized. But of course these symbols was popular enough that they started to permeate through popular culture. So the wealthy might wear something like this. And this particular piece is a ring with two skeletons on either side holding up this wonderful coffin. Inside another skeleton. This is the lid. A beautiful thing. We've got red enamel, black enamel, and the wonderful cross. Let's have another look at it. Isn't that glorious? And what I love about a piece like this is, would you be terrified to know that this isn't about death, or at least it's contested that it's not about death, but actually, very much, possibly, a betrothal ring. So can you imagine giving that to your loved ones and saying, I love you so much, but you know. It's fantastic. There's actually two clasped hands at the base of the shoulders. The shoulders of the band. So it's all there. And this is what people were wearing in terms of identity and fashion. But it's very much here. We've got to think about how much the British influenced this, at least the English alone. It's a very changing thing, especially the further down Europe you go. So the more Catholic things get, so French, Middle French, as we go further towards Italy and down to the Mediterranean, this disappears. You don't see this so much. Because they're still using Jesus, they're still using Mary, they're still using the saints. Whereas here, wealth, desecration of the body, fashion, live a better life, work harder, teach your kids better. It's all there. And it's not so simple as just to say, well, mortality was just in front of us at every given moment. Of course it always was. Interment of the body, mortality rates, all of that was simply there all the time. So this was something that started to come up through Protestantism. That was the big split, 1517. You can just about set your jewel to it. And of course another piece here from about 1600. And once again, if someone was wearing this, you think about the affluence of the person. You think about their value system. It's a beautiful piece. Not necessarily about death just yet, but it's certainly a consideration of death. So when we start to see modern skulls, we've got to think about those too and what they actually mean in representation of identity. But right here, you're living a better life. And you see some glorious depictions of skulls from about this time. And also, I just wanted to dovetail quickly into posy rings. So posy, poetry. They're these wonderful rings with sentiments written on the inside and outside of the rings. Some of them are very cheap to produce. Some of them are quite affluent. It was actually something of a family tradition where the more learned of the family would help pick out the different sentiments that would be written around. And this went from Middle French, Latin, and also phonetic English, because remember there was no dictionary at the time. So you see beautiful sentiments like, to thee I choose, C-H-U-S-E. You know, gorgeous things. But as you start to go up the line, this particular one says, "A time will come and my longing keeps me awake." A beautiful thing. It's stunning to see that. It's in French. But part of this was also part of the mourning sentiment, as you'll see in bands later on. Mourning jewelry started to retain as many of these little mementos as possible, and you'll see these being used for mourning jewels, you'll see them being used for loving tokens, betrothal rings, all sorts of things, but they're a little bit cheaper. And also related to things like chapbooks, so where people would be chapbook salesmen, very cheap pieces of paper where they would go from town to town with wonderful little other lyrical things people could sing, poetry, political dissertation, things very much for the people. They were very, very cheap. And you can see a lot of these posy rings actually transpose a lot of those things because people could read them off the page and turn them into a jewel. And mourning jewelry sort of dovetails again with that. Other side of that. However, we always have to go back to primary research. Now, I've been researching and teaching for 14 years. Well, researching for a lot longer, actually. I've been collecting since 1996. A million years ago, 2 centuries. So we all know who this fellow is here, right? It's William Shakespeare. So we do know from records that his wife and his daughter have mourning rings made for them in his will, and also for 3 of his acting colleagues. So we start to see primary records at this time from about 1616. That 1600, 1616 period, those wills started to become typical. And as they became typical, people would copy that giving of a jewel at the point of death. So even though it had already happened, we start to see that money be put aside, which is very, very important in terms of this is society. I always say there's no such thing as a main catalyst, but when we're looking at mourning jewels and sentimental jewels, we need to look up the chain as much as possible. We need to see what the kings and queens were doing. Because remember, they were essentially the rock stars of their day. They're the ones who are the identity of fashion. So we look to them, they're the ones who could afford it. So if we could copy what they were doing, essentially that would make us very fashionable too. Which is this fellow here. So this is Charles I. Now this particular piece, made for a royalist, it's an interesting piece. I'll show the back of it. So this is the Julian calendar, 1648. He was actually decapitated in 1649. So prior to this, we had between 1642 and 1651 the English Civil War. So the Cromwell period came after this. So we had 11 years of the Cromwell period, his son, and then we get the restoration of Charles II, which is very, very important because it's a jewel like this which resonated with the rest of society. The royalists might have worn something like this, but it's not because it was hidden necessarily, but because people knew about it. And because they knew about it, if their loved one passed away, just like old Charles I here, it's all good. We could actually copy that style. So miniaturists could start to copy this particular style because the loved one had passed away, and we could create a miniature for them. So it becomes popular. And that execution was one of those catalysts, or at least moments, not the catalyst of, but people started to see it because there became a faction. And I'm in England now, so it's different to teaching in America where I've got to teach a bit more English history. But you've got Parliament and you've got the Crown. And in between, essentially, that would be the big movement between the two until we get solidification by about 1707. The trick was we don't want another Catholic on the throne after that. If you want to keep it simple, I like keeping it simple. But it's a beautiful piece, and we start to see the marks of the skull and crossbones here. And these pieces were copied. But also it becomes popular in the lexicon of jewellery because we start to see it happen in other forms of jewellery that weren't typical at the time. And this beautiful piece here, with the black enamel, all the glorious Baroque stylings, it's unassuming, but it has this wonderful hinge at the top. Interesting. And inside there he is. So you could walk around with a beautiful jewel, say you're a royalist, but nobody knows it because it's closed. It's a beautiful token of love for someone you want back on the crown. You want to reinstall these people back, but unfortunately they're gone. So this particular ring here, once again, wasn't relegated just for the crown, it could be something that was copied for loved ones. And that's where mourning jewellery starts to change. So we saw Memento Mori and that ideal of you will die. Okay, live a better life. And it's only about now that it starts to become reappropriated and used as the identity of death, which is very, very important for this time. And it was also a time of mass attrition. And I should state that also hair giving. So I'm not sure if anyone's really got any pieces of human hair jewellery. It's quite typical in mourning jewellery and sentimental jewellery. But there are records back to 1660 in the court of Charles II where people were wearing hair bracelets, and the giving of a hair bracelet was actually already part of popular lexicon. People were wearing them as sentimental gifts. So we have records dating right back to then of the gift of hair work and weaving of hair. So it's really interesting to see that resonate as we will get to the 19th century where there's so much of abundance of hair, it's just a typical material that people used. And this particular piece is a watch, about 1660. And it's really interesting at this time as well because the 1660s had so much mass attrition. And this is what really also changed out. You've got the growth of mourning jewellery, the restoration at this side, and then at this side you've got wonderfully horrible things happening to this very town, which is incredible. So in 1665 you've got the Great Plague of London, 100,000 people affected by it. 1666, the Great Fire of London. We've got 13,200 houses and 87 churches perish in this very town. 1683 to 1694 we have a great frost. And then by 1685 Charles II had passed away. So at this time we see that the identity of death starts to permeate through just what it was to be alive. We've lost so many people. And the jewellery represents this. And also the industry represents this. Because this was a demand. With all of this attrition, with all of these people who could create jewellery, you've got people who could want it, and you've got people who could create it. So the industry of the mourning culture began by about the 1680s. And this piece is a beautiful one, Decite Invitatum. This comes from the court of Louis XIV. So at this time, by 1686, the revocation of the Edict of the Nantes forced a lot of those Protestant French into England. And what did they bring with them? Wonderful jewellery construction methodologies. So they could create beautiful things in London. And that's wonderful. So as they start to get out of Europe, they bring with them enough to create a business. And there was a high demand for this business. So jewels, the identity of death, mourning culture start to become something which that middle class could start to afford. And it starts to turn into this. Colloquially known as a Stuart Crystal, this is a ribbon slide, and the crystal is just the faceted crystal on top. Known so because of its popularity at the time, but it was popular from right up to about 1720s. Doesn't mean it disappeared, because plenty of jewels still lasted after the fact. However, it became an anachronism, ribbon slides. So this would have a hoop here and here on the reverse. You would put a ribbon to it. It'd be worn at the bust or the bodice or the neck. And here we have Death himself. We've got the skull and crossbones. We've got the two cherubs blowing horns and Come Ye Blessed written on top. We've got the woven hair here. And this is where hair weaving starts to become just part of the popular jewellery of mourning. Underneath here is just fabric. It's the base material. So by the 1680s, something like this would be very typical to see someone wear because they've lost someone very dear to them. It was also used for popular jewellery as well. Not the death symbols, of course, but the style of ribbon and the slide. They were just popular. But here, mourning jewellery, there it is. And I'm also a big fan of, say, the period of Mary II and William III, because they co-ruled together. We've got the kingdoms of Scotland, we've got Ireland, we've got England. This follows James II and VII, who was deposed, and there was a big push essentially the Jacobites. They would go right through to the 1740s trying to reinstate that crown, but essentially we don't want Catholics back on the throne. That's the long and the short of it. That's the short of it. This particular piece is from 1694, and this is Mary II's hair. But as you can see, always look towards what was popular at the time. What was the jewel that was actually the one that people would be resonating with? This particular piece obviously has the same construction detail as this slide here, as you can see. It would have the same loops on the back. We have Mary Regina, that's her hair. We have the skull, the bones. We have all of the royal symbols in there as well. And it's such a simple piece. It's not very big, it's about this big. Slides aren't very big. You can see them at just about any antique shop around here. And these beautiful things, they became part of the culture, so they were popular. If you're a collector, if you're a fan, you can actually start to see these change over the years between 1680 and 1720, just because of the shape of the jewel itself. They start to become a little squared off. But we'll see a bit more of that in a minute. Because first things first, I'd like to take you on a little trip into the Baroque and Rococo. Only between the 1700 to 1760 period. It lasted previous to that, obviously, but why I'm actually focusing on this in Mourning Jewels is because the jewels themselves started to adapt and change, especially by the 1720 period. Now, the Baroque and Rococo, they're art styles, of course. So don't think they're specific styles for specific years. It's just that we need to understand when we look at the jewellery why the jewels changed and what were the influences of their change. And we see this beautiful piece here. So from 1715, we have all of the identity of death right here. We have the coffin at the top. We have the Baroque around the band. This would have been inlaid with beautiful black enamel. The remnants are still a bit there. But the coffin itself, the desecration of the body, is up front and centre. And Baroque itself, well, if we've ever seen Baroque in action, if we've seen it in a cathedral, if we've ever been to a palace, I mean, how do you feel? Very small. It's a very dominant, powerful element. And here, it's no different than wearing that on your finger. It's a dominant, powerful element. We have a ring with all of the inscription inside. Remember, just like those posies we saw earlier. But here we've got the name, the date of death, and the beautiful skull up on top with the wire cipher with the initials underneath the coffin. All of that is that dominance. And we need to focus on that here because as people are wearing these, remember, it's identity and fashion. So it's not trying to beautify it, it's just saying that I clearly know that person's in mourning. And even with those other slides, I know that person's in mourning. It becomes part of popular culture, it becomes part of what we do as English.
Can I just ask something?
Certainly.
Do they wear it for a certain length of time? When do they put it aside?
Oh, I'll be on that in a minute.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. It's actually very interesting. There's records about that. It was the upper class who were getting a little bit angry that the lower classes started to emulate the styles, what they were doing, in about the 1730s. But I jump ahead, sorry, I jump around a bit. So we do have records at this time. So in 1700, we've got Robert Walpole, the Earl of Oxford. He donated 72 rings to family at £1 each. So we start to see how much these costed at the time. So some were very expensive, some were very cheap. But of course, at the 1700 period, we've still got that elitism that's going on within culture and society. 1703, we've got Samuel Pepys, gave 123 rings at the point of his death. So all of these records exist. And Queen Anne, between 1702 and 1707, we've got unification. And that's also important. Because all of this infighting, all of this bickering, all of this destabilisation of culture, remember, you're living in this culture which isn't just as uniform as we wanted. But the fashion that we wore it was becoming more and more staid. But the crown's just immobile at the moment. There's all of this infighting. There's Catholic money from France being pushed right through Scotland, trying to destabilise who we are as a people. And yet, the jewellery holds us together. The fact that we are English, the fact that we are strong, holds us together. And that's only going to grow, especially through the 19th century. But the desecration of the body never ever left, and at this time it even became more powerful. So you'll see rings like this When I say typical, not typical to purchase today, but you'll see many, many examples of them in museums and other places. You'll see this as a skeletal band. So the idea of the skeleton and all of those symbols of death were at their absolute peak at this time. So by about that high, just previous 1720 period, you'll see a few of these. They didn't just phase out though. I think that's one of the big misnomers about just fashion in general, but specifically mourning jewellery. People say that if it ended at a certain time, it never existed afterwards. But we don't know the values of the person who wore this. We don't know the maker of the who did this. We don't know how old this was when it was completely produced. It could have been old stock. It happens a lot. I've seen anachronisms with skulls and crossbones right through to the 1780s. And they were just part of the value system of the family. How do we know we've got records? We might have something of that family. And this particular piece here, Memento Mori, it's about as elaborate as it gets. We've gone from putting skeletons all the way through the band, and we're telling you right now what Memento Mori is. It says it on the band. So there's no obfuscation here, there's no change, there's just, this is completely about death. But then we get to something, to the Rococo era. So this piece here from Thomas Flack comes from about 1736. It's a design plate with all of these jewels looking completely different to the ones we just saw. They were all big and bold. These are open. These are beautiful, almost the same way that Art Nouveau in the 20th century was a reaction to a lot of what we're going to be looking at in the 19th century. They're stunning. And as this Rococo style influenced, it pushed up through France. A lot of influence came through Austria. You've got the Jacques Blonde style moving through, and it comes into London itself. And then we start to see jewels like this. So these beautiful mourning jewels start to take on these wonderful, wonderful shoulders, and the entire band itself takes over with a rolled interior, the beautiful ribbons, organic shapes. But notice, the actual style doesn't actually change that much. It's still got the date of death, it's still got the name of the person, and under here we've got our skulls and crossbones with our crystal. It's all there. But if we see it in this kind of light, we start to see a lot of the standardization that happened. The wonderful thing about jewelers is they could put and design the names around these fine little ribbons all the way around, and you'd see some abbreviation, some truncation of names, but generally the quality was so good, they would have that with the inlay, with the enamel inlay. Here we've got the white enamel symbolizing purity, virgin innocence, black, death, absence of light. So you could say it was an unmarried person, it was a child, it might have the age there. And we go into the more higher end of what it was. And you can see here, we've got the fleur-de-lis, we've got a lot of the French motifs. We've got this wonderful rosette shape underneath the bezel, which is stunning. And you can see the rolled interior. So pieces like this were actually just generally popular for their time. If you changed out, so the name and date of death, to become generic, just as a filled band. If you change this out to be, say, an amethyst or a different gem, it would be a very popular ring to have been worn at the time. And it's a stunning thing, and that's a complete changeover from what we just seen in the Baroque. So once again, mourning jewels don't actually completely change, they adapt, just like human behaviour. We don't change our behaviour, we just adapt behaviour, and so do mourning jewellery. Because right now there's an industry moving along. An industry of which employed some of the first women in early modern times because they were weaving hair. Not at the front of shop, of course, that was always a man, but at this time, right in that first half of the 18th century, women are employed, which I love. And I will get to a bit of that in a minute. Here we have a Giardinetti ring, and also the influence of flowers and how these and colours started to form in this particular period. So the 18th century started to use a lot more gems than had previously been seen. It's a pretty ring, but once again, when it came to the beautiful things around mourning jewellery, once again, mourning jewellery adapts. And here we have a piece, Cease Thy Tears, Religion Points on High. This one's from 1792, so we're jumping ahead a bit. But the Giardinetti ring also can be used for the sake of mourning, as can a lot of other styles. There's not one set particular style. And also we have to think about betrothal rings and all of the other rings which were used and reinscribed after the date of death. because they had continuity and lifespan, not just because they were produced at the time of death. This particular piece is just a lovely one. It's a gorgeous thing to look at. So fashionable, yes. Mourning, absolutely. If it didn't have the inscription, who knows? You can't say for sure. And I'm going to jump straight into Neoclassicism. This is one of my favourite ones because it's so beautiful and it represents the human so much. So 1760 to about 1820. Once again, fuzzy numbers, but some wonderful things happen. So in 1760, George William Frederick was crowned George III, so we've entered the Georgian period well and truly. George I, not someone who cared so much for the crown. He'd visited here a few times, but his home was where he wanted it to be, which wasn't here. But by the time we got to George III, all right, now we start to look at. I don't like to classify things as set Georgian or Victorian. You're covering off over 100 years of history, and that's just not right. We need to look at it a bit more insular, and Neoclassicism is a great way to look at that microcosm. So in 1711, so a little bit before this, there were digs in Herculaneum and Pompeii. So all of this rich archaeology was pulled out of the ground, and this coincides with around this period where we've got the wonderful humanist period. And it starts to bring back a lot of these symbols and motifs which the Romans and the Greeks had used, and so we started to use them. We've been challenged enough in life, and we're going through a period of mass affluence, especially by the 1780s, and mass change by that time as well. So it's a wonderful period just to see how all of this changed society. Also, the Herculaneum was in 1738, so it took a bit of time for it to resonate back here, and a lot of that archaeology was taken back here. Now, so this is the Ordre chronologique de duel de la cour. This shows some of the mourning periods that were ordained in court in France at the day. So one thing also is that just because the mourning periods were enforced by court, and remember court is here and humanity and the rest of society is here, they're using what court did in their daily life. Just because court might be wearing some of these things doesn't mean they were set what you had to do on your day-to-day. Why? Well, let's look at it. For the wife. So my wife has died. So the first mourning, or the wool phase, black wool suit and black wool stockings for 6 weeks, first 3 with deep weepers on cuffs. For the second, or the silk phase, black suit with silk stockings and fringed linen, and by the time we get to half mourning, 6 weeks in black suit with silver buckles and sword. Now, who can afford all that? You see, it's not that simple. So what we've got to do is adhere to those kinds of first, second, ordinary and half as much as we possibly can. By the time of the 19th century, it gets a lot easier because it's accessible and affordable. But by the 18th century, it's still on its way. So, dyes are just becoming predominantly used. People would dye their old dresses for the weeds, and they would start to represent themselves in mourning. But when you get to, 6 weeks black and white with diamonds, we couldn't do that underneath court, okay? It just wasn't affordable. If anyone wants this as a reference, and there's also the 19th century variation of it, I've written quite a lot about it on artofmourning.com. Please just use the search engine and it's all there. But these are generally what you've got to look for. Parents, godparents, brother, sister, aunt, uncle, first cousin, second cousin, for husband and wife. 6 months for the, but if it was for the husband, remember women have it always the hard way, don't they? 1 year and 6 weeks. Isn't that great? Second stage, 6 months in black mourning with silk with white crepe trimmings and black stores, and 6 weeks in black and white accessories, all black and white. I've also written a lot on the colours of mourning, so there's also a lot on Art of Mourning, 14 years worth in fact, so please have a look at that if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty. But onwards we go. Now, why I love the Neoclassical period is because humanist, enlightenment, female. The female rises to prominence. So we've got, in this piece here, the female allegory becomes the ideal. She becomes my figure of mourning, grief, love, and that is who I identify with. Male or female, the lady in the neoclassical dress becomes that figurehead for me. Here, grief. The Weeping Willow, this is all in sepia, painted on ivory. There is cut hair on this, so you can see that that's stippled area here, that's hair. And we've got faith and hope here, and she's pointing towards the heavens. She is the allegory. She's not an actual person. And I love that. And I love it particularly this time. We've got the blue stocking movement. We've got Georgiana, the Duchess of Devonshire. So, once again, influential in politics, opening their doors to, of their parlours to have thought on science, maths, technology, literature, all of those disciplines. Not that they were set disciplines because they were one. But here we have women becoming empowered, and that's why I love these periods especially. And this piece from 1796 really represents that in a glorious way. This one is for mourning, obviously, for Sarah Hornlett, who passed away in 1796. But also, we've got to look at the pop culture of the time, between the 1770s and 1780s. Because at this time, there was a lot of affluence. There was a lot of money coming in. The French are really dictating good fashion, and it's moving very, very fast into England. And then we have things like the urn, and I love the urn. This particular piece from 1779 shows the chopped hair in three-dimensional high relief. It's a beautiful piece. But also the urn itself was used for many, many different things. Is it just death? We always have to ask ourselves, what are we looking at and why? And then we see something like this. So the dead shall live, the living die. We've got a lady pointing towards the tomb. We have all of the affectation here of mourning, don't we? It's painted on ivory, it's a sepia piece. It's in its original box. It's pretty. But what we've got to do is do our research, because if you don't do your research, you don't really know. And one of the things I love is getting right deep into research, especially during the 1780s, because you see all these weird things. Notice the design. This is a ticket for Handel's The Messiah. It's pop culture. That's what it is. They started to copy things. So you see a lot of these sentimental depictions become, actually, they're just popular culture. It's no different than someone wearing a t-shirt and digging it up in 200 years' time and making assumptions saying, well, that person has a skull and a t-shirt, so it must be death. We've got to ask ourselves why. Much like this one. This is one of the famous ones. So, The Sorrows of Young Werther. It was published in 1774 and again in 1787 by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Now, this is one of the famous plates from it, Charlotte at the Tomb of Werther. Now notice all of the affectation here. We've got our urn, our column. This is all perfect neoclassical symbolism for death. We've got our weeping willow. It's as allegorical as it can possibly be. So once again, we look at some of these jewels which have the same depictions in them and we think, oh, it's mourning, it's death, it's death, it's death. And then we see something like this wonderful blue jasper dipped stoneware piece. And this is for the very same thing as this. It's also Charlotte at the Tomb of Werther. So is it mourning? No. Is it popular? Yes. Does it have all the affectation of mourning? Absolutely. But it's popular culture. So much so, Napoleon used to carry a copy of it around with him, and all the pretty young things. It was a huge moment in pop culture. People used to go to the cemeteries. They would hold the book. They would dress in the same manner as this, and they would stand next to urns and tombs, and they've got the affectation in society, and it bleeds its way through to jewellery. So once again, if I was just not knowing these things, I would look at that and say, that's a mourning jewel, but I wouldn't know its context, which comes from research once more. Then we have just the 1770s, and I think that once again from the 1660s, we have another period of destabilisation. So 1776, American succession. That's a huge, huge thing. In 1788, what happened there? Well, here I am, Australia. 1789, the storming of the Bastille. Very, very important. So 1799 and right through 1793 and 4, we've got the French Terror. But yet these jewels still existed. Just quickly, a jewel like this particularly was tailored out over time. You might see a sepia piece with a different name on it, but the design is the same. Travelling miniaturists used to go from town to town. They would have this pre-designed, and you can tell from the different coloured ink they would use that they would just tailor out the sentiments and the names. Easy to produce, cheap. You might see the more continental pieces, so a piece in Europe might be a more literal depiction. The allegorical castles, people running, the mausoleums and the tombs themselves, temples, they were all used in the same way as the neoclassical pieces through the same period during that late 18th century. So they still use the same affectation, but remember, Catholic. And we've got Protestants. We've got those symbols of death and more of the human enlightenment. Here, it's almost a flip. We're looking at that literal depiction of just that eternal flame. And this piece here is from 1783. And then we get those ones which confuse us, because once again, if we looked at this piece without this, we would think, that is just a piece which is reminiscent of love. Two lovebirds, the wreath, we've got our cherub coming down to anoint it, we've got growth in the garden, we'd like to have children, yet it's a piece like this without anything written on the back of it, without this white and black enamel. And it's not always the way, white and black enamel. If it didn't have the inscription on the back, I couldn't necessarily state it was for death, but it is for death. Could have that been something which was done post-mortem? Possibly, but the inscription's there. So once again, unless there's an inscription, we need to question everything. And I'd like to focus on this gentleman for a second. So the gentleman, if depicted in a sepia piece, is quite individual. Now, notice our neoclassical lady from previously. She is in the Greco-Roman dress with the folds, the underbust cut, the headdress and the veil. Breeches, pantaloons, frock coat. His hair's done in a fashionable style. If the man is used in these jewels, it is more of a depiction of the actual gentleman in mourning. So this is closer to a snapshot of how life was. This is more closer to a miniature portrait than the female pieces. This is why I find the male pieces a little more haunting in terms of, they're closer in proximity to the death, and this piece for a child. But we still have all the other elements here for a lady who would be in mourning. But there, this poor man is in repose. It's a beautiful, beautiful sentiment. And then we hit the heights of the Neoclassical period. We've got something like this. It says Resurgam, there's your tomb with the child breaking free. This is all in high relief in pieces of ivory. We've got the Weeping Willow Key, which is painted on the reverse of the miniature, and the miniature itself is about this big. It's quite large. We've got cypress pointing towards the heavens where the child's going and an angel awaiting it. It's when the Neoclassical period got its most beautiful and lush. It really used all of the elements. But as of course with everything, what goes up must come down. Just to detract a little bit, silhouettes. I love silhouettes, so I thought I'd just throw a bit in there. So silhouettes, somewhat said to be coined by Etienne de Silhouettes. Much earlier, silhouette cutters, quite cheap. We still have silhouettes today. You might go down to the foreshore, people do take the silhouettes. They were used for memorial jewellery, but also just as sentimental jewellery. So I like to focus on that just a little bit. You might see a sentiment of death on them. Or you might just see a beautiful, simple depiction, and this a loving piece here, and you can see from here, there's her hair and Eleanor. A piece like this with the gift of giving of hair, we should always focus on, because hair is one of the most important elements at that turn of the 19th century. So why? We'll get to that in a second. But these things here, cheap to produce, and obviously very, very sentimental. I'd love to get into the history of it, but we've got to keep moving. And then we see ones like Myers and Field, which show you just that level of, we've got those simple ones, and we've got Myers and Field, who at the time, on his death actually, Myers had £20,000 to give to his family. That was what was left over from his estate. So you can see that this popular manufacturer, not far from here actually, produced these beautiful silhouettes. And they're sentimental and just loving pieces. So I do love the pop culture and the weird things that happen in that sort of late 18th, early 19th century. And even pieces like this. So Myers died in 21. Just you can see the colour and the variation that was used. These things could be very affluent, but they're also accessible. And I like to always go back to how accessible jewellery should be. Because at this time people needed it. It was something that people appreciated to have. So we could have pieces that were cheap, and we could have pieces that were expensive, and silhouettes really balance that out. You can see this one here, highly affluent. This one here from Myers, beautiful thing. But of course also it's the oddities. eye miniature portraits. So we've got Maria Fitzherbert, so 1785. She was a Catholic widow, and the widow of Edward Weld, by the way. And I talk a bit about George IV, the Prince Regent, the Prince of Wales. Now, he had his proclivities. He's an interesting fellow. Prince of Wales with an H. However you want to depict him. He wasn't very good to his wife, marriage of convenience for money. Interesting father to his daughter Charlotte, and we'll get to her in a second. But Maria he loved very much. So he went to the court miniaturist. Now she was a widow. So at this time we've got more governance around who can the crown marry. Now we can't just go off and marry a Catholic widow, so he couldn't. There was a special council devoted to that. So he had an eye miniature made of her, which he wore into his lapel, and the Duke of Wellington found it on his body the day he died. Why an eye? It's anonymous. So that anonymity could be worn here, and no one's going to suggest that he's going to do anything too radical on the throne. But of course, when people know about it, they copy it. So all of these pretty young things started to go out and create eye miniature portraits. And you'll find these for post-mortem as well. The eye looking up, you'll see them in teardrop settings, often with black enamel around them. But it was just a thing to do, and that sort of went from about 1790 to about 1820. But glorious little things, and you'll see them around, but they're getting very, very scarce. And there's quite a few over at the V&A. This one here is from 1794, a beautiful piece as well. But then we've got Princess Charlotte, and she died in childbirth in 1817, his daughter. Now, when it comes to those big moments of nationalism and mourning, those are the things which really spurred forward people copying those styles and mourning becoming very popular. And it was her death, actually, where the Lord Chamberlain overruled the court mourning procedure. So I will put that on Art of Mourning once again if you want to go through that. But essentially he changed the periods of mourning. He changed the types and styles of what people should be wearing. So crepes, bombazines, covered surfaces, lots of black, what the men should be wearing as well. Of course the men had it better. But it was the nationalist outpouring at her death which created candlesticks, plates, cups, more jewellery, souvenir jewellery on her death because people loved her very much. And we've always got to look back to those moments, and that's what really changed things as much as, say, Queen Victoria did. And it's always Queen Victoria when I stand in front of people that everyone says, oh, it's mourning jewellery, it must be Victorian. Well, no, it's actually, Charlotte had a lot to do with her death because she was that popular. But at this time, things were changing. So we're looking at that 1817, 1800 period. You can see here this piece is quite basic. And we've just seen those high element pieces painted on ivory showing all of those Greco-Roman motifs and the beautiful symbolism. Here, painted on paper, watercolour. And on the reverse, hair weaving, very basic. And we've got zinc added to the gold, low-grade gold. So we've got to think about what was happening between the 1800s, 1815 period. The Napoleonic Wars. So during that French Terror, 1793-4, what happened? People raided the aristocracy. What did they take? Gold. What did they put it towards? The government. Essentially go into the war effort. What happened to gems? Nobody wanted them. They went back. They became quite easy to purchase. So the idea of colour theory and gems really happened around about this time, that 1790 to about 1820 period. And pieces like this could be easily produced. But they're emulating those popular styles. And we see pieces like this. This is Berlin iron. So other, say in Middle Europe, obviously Berlin, people would go give their gold for the war effort and they would get a piece of this in return. Highly fragile but very beautiful. However, the English were a bit different. You see this beautiful non-conformist style in the first quarter of the 19th century. So this particular ring had no real style to go from, but what it didn't have was gold. Notice it's closer to rose gold. We've got this open band. And we've got hair started to become more prominent in the front because hair's cheap. We've got open gold. We've got less gold. So the craftspeople at that time were very brilliant at making more with less. And you can see that here. In fact, it's this particular style here not the prongs so much, but the interior. That's what really came out of, say, that 1815 period. You've got these wonderful little shapes, geometric shapes, and the use of seed pearls. You might see this with gems in it, because the gems are cheap. These are paste, by the way, but also hair. So that sentimentality changes along with the memorial jewels at the same time. And you see acrostic rings like this, so diamond, emerald, amethyst, ruby, emerald, sapphire, and topaz. D-E-A-R-E-S-T, dearest. So at this time, these gems started to become part of, well, they were cheap, and also these were popular even in paste, so don't devalue the use of paste in these early 19th century pieces. Quite popular, and the sentimentality and understanding of what it was to have these coloured gems became popular. Also colour theory, and that also goes back to the same von Goethe that we saw at the trials of the Sorrows of young Werther. And here you can see the same particular jewel in situ. Notice how we've got stamped gold, less gold, but we can make more out of it. Open pieces, say in this crescent. We don't have as much gold, but we've got more gems. We've got turquoise, so we should use more colour. So colour starts to represent things at this time. And here we've also got this one other thing that I like to focus on at the very end. These are from about 1826. You might see their style date to about 1819. And notice this. Machine turning, the Industrial Revolution. So you can see this in jewels at the time. This is a brother and sister piece, and they're beautiful. The black enamel's there. But it's because of the Industrial Revolution we start to see a change over in style. We're not yet hitting conformity. And I'll breeze through this. It's the Gothic Revival period. So Augustus Willoughby Northmore Pugin was very influential, and looking to a lot of the excesses that the Regency period had. So we're looking at a lot of money being lost, a lot of money being thrown into the arts, and he wanted to go back to more of that simple time, where things were more pious, where people lived better with less. So the Gothic Revival period was also a very intelligent way for politics to really influence how people behaved in popular culture and society. And this goes right through that sort of, I mean, he was influencing it from 1790, but it was about 1840 when it became really popular. And you can see it here in this particular ring from William IV. So he passed away in 1837, and you can see all the elements there of simplicity. So we've lost a lot of the pomp and circumstance of the Neoclassical period. We've gone through simplicity because we had less, and now the Gothic period is very interesting because it influences a lot of the styles. So take this piece from a lot earlier, about 20 years earlier. Actually, no, sorry. What we're going to see here is almost contemporary with this. Notice that they're both bands, they both have the same sentiments, yet one shows that heavy tombstone-like Gothic lettering. We've got black enamel, we've got the bold acanthus and roses. This is from 1817. The earlier these pieces get, they're very heavy. But here, that would be a contemporary ring to this. So that neoclassical die-out, this is just simple, geometric, and heavy Gothic. Once again, if this was worn at the neck, you can imagine what people thought of the person wearing it. She's in mourning. You can't avoid it. In memory of. This became the primary statement for the rest of the 19th century. And it's there. It's basically telling the woman that she is in mourning. It's showing that the woman is in mourning. And it's dominant. It's powerful. We create a lot of these big, heavy flourishes, even from the Rococo period. We took what we could. But there it is, in memory of. Which gets us to the importance of Victoria. Oh, by the way, as these pieces got bigger, we had the Hallmarking Act of 1854. So that allowed for lower grade alloys to be used in jewellery. So as things like the crinoline and bigger sleeves became a thing, jewels had to become bigger and bigger at the wrist. So a jewel like this got bigger and bigger. So it's harder and harder to avoid in society. Once again, fashion, identity. In a place that is colonising the rest of the world, in a society that is creating identity through what they were doing in the 1850s. What have we got? We've got Charles Dickens, we've got propaganda, we've got Christmas time, we've got economics, we've got Christmas cards, we've got all of those things which we still do today, right down to the 8-hour day. And we still live in that 19th century paradigm. Good Christian family, very, very smart for stability, because even in Prussia, things weren't doing so good. And even Victoria had several attempts on her life. So when you create consistency through culture and identity, you create that fashion which says stability. And they were very good at it. So Victoria, this is her first locket, given to her on her first birthday, 24th of May 1820. Now, when you've got someone who's influenced from all of these beautiful pieces, of course, sentimentality is going to bleed through society. But it was really the death of him in 1861 which changed everything, and we can see that all the way around us in this beautiful town. Victoria obviously loved him very much. This is Albert, the Prince Consort, and what generally most people think of when they think of mourning jewellery is Victoria in her weeds. Now, it was the main catalyst because of, this is what court adornment should be in mourning. So this is where a lot of people deviate. They start to say that everything from that late 19th century period, worn in black, is about death. Jet jewellery, death. Hair jewellery, death. It's not. It's because it was popularised through the monarchy, just like George IV. Just like we've gone back to Charles II. We've gone right through history. She's just influencing society and culture. Her biggest mistake is she didn't change over an entire generation. So you've got 40 years of perpetual mourning, which she would come out of in silver, a silver jubilee for a little bit, just to wear some other jewels, but it's still not permissible. So it's frustrating. So I'm an 18-year-old girl in 1880. Why am I doing something to wear black because my uncle passed away and I've got to wear this for a year and 6 days? It doesn't make sense. And it was part of that was the rebellion against the mourning culture. But in memory of, now we've lost a lot of the Gothic flourishes here, but here's where we see that consistency in Victorian jewellery. This piece here is a little bit earlier, it's from 1853, it's my first mourning ring. I love it very much from Mary Ann Lewis, and these are two serpents coiled around the shoulders, and underneath this is her hair. First piece I ever bought, and 15 years later, its sister piece actually came to me from a dealer just over there who'd not spoken to me in a year, sends me a picture and an email saying, "You like black enamel jewellery, Hayden, what do you think it is?" Mary Ann Lewis, 1853. So remember, it's all about the person. I talk about politics a lot, but that person died, and these are living history pieces. But also we've got floriography. So we've got the Henry Phillips in 1825 developing a lot of the ideas of what it was to have the flowers. By the time of the mid-19th century, we've got thousands of different categorizations for what the nature of flowers, flora and fauna, essentially meant. And we start to see it, say, in this Forget-Me-Not piece, be used cross-culturally. So we can't undervalue the importance of what it is to look at a jewel and see flowers. And you'll see it on tombstones as well. Once again, Art of Mourning is a giant resource section with all of that stipulated and laid out. But also, hair work was a massive industry. So this is aphoria. We're seeing hair weavers start to fight against each other. We start to see it as an industry, just the same as we saw silhouettes earlier on. So aphoria, this is a beautiful piece from 1841 in its original box. Showing just how important these simple weaves of hair were. Hair became just as important. And by the 1850s, up to tons of hair were imported into London year on year, grown by nuns in convents, and cut. And then they were long, so they were sold back into London. But a lot of these weavers, they didn't use the hair that were given to them because you get this much hair. They would colour match the hair, get rid of it, use it for something else, and weave it on a spindle into something beautiful like this. It's colour matched, I'm sorry. And also, you'd see it used in beautiful palette worked art pieces like this. And we still have the original designs for these as well. So you can actually match these back to their original catalogues. And that's another important segue into catalogues. So this particular one, New York, 1870, very, very important because we can see this replicated from London into New York and into Melbourne, Australia, where I'm from. These catalogues started to become cross-cultural, and as these jewels became cross-cultural, these jewels could be made cross-culturally. So that colony in Australia could create the same jewels as London. It didn't have to be imported. It was just about who could weave them. It's the same in America. America, this is an American plate, but it's the same as one you would just get over here. And that's where hair work, its biggest misconception is. This particular piece has 7 different weaves of hair in it. It's actually a piece for a family. It's a family reunion in 1855. It's not about death, it's about a moment, because families could weave hair. We've got Mark Campbell's Self-Instructor in the Art of Hair Work, and that's 1867, and earlier books, I forget the names of, but in 1855 we've got the Paris exhibition showing off just how important hair work was, and we've got French hair weavers who were saying that their styles were better than the English, that they were using more flowers, they were using more decorative elements, that theirs weren't about being a mortuary tablet, in their own words. They were being about affluence and prettiness, not about being about death. And such is this one here. It's just a beautiful token of love for the family. Even this one, it to a loving daughter from her mother is on the reverse of this piece, and on either side has hair. This palette worked hair here with the beautiful curls, a gorgeous little thing, but a loving token. It's from about 1861. And going back to hair as an importance, because it was easy and cheap. Once again, this is accessible for people of all sorts. It can be woven into chains and used on a daily basis. And I strongly advocate for people who want to get into collecting this kind of jewellery. Remember, sentimental. There's a difference here. You can get these chains very, very cheap, such as these are some of mine. You can catalogue them just by their clasps and their fittings. So we can see here this delightful black enamel acorn, and all of these other things can be dated, just like that. So it's a great way to get into collecting, but a weave like this is strong, and a gentleman could have worn this in his day-to-day with his charms on it, with his watch on one, with his watch key, and all of his elements for his day-to-day. It's strong, it's flexible. Well, we assume that it's the loved one's hair, we don't know, but it's close enough in colour, and it's all there. So it's sentimental, it's cheap, and it's accessible. And also it could accommodate different charms, just like this in photography. Bracelets as well. So we talked about bracelets dating all the way back to the 1660s. And this particular piece from about the 1870s shows how the different hair could be used in different ways. Is it mourning? No, I don't know. Prove it. That's what you've got to say to all these pieces. Prove it. You can't say. There's no dedication of death on it. It's sentimental. And obviously jewellery started to conform its size around photography. So by the 1840s onwards, as photography morphed and changed and its different technologies allowed for smaller and smaller styles, the jewels had to adapt. So you might see gold-filled pieces from about the 1860s, I should say, and right through the 1870s and 80s, shrinking a little bit, showing photography. You'd see coloured photography with hand paint over the top, and it's all about jewellery adapting. And that's why lockets are actually really important and still used today. They're worn under the shirt predominantly, and a lot of people who might have lost children still collect a lot of these, and they wear them close to their heart. They're still fashionable. That's why a lot of those other ones, just like ribbon slides, don't exist today, because lockets can still be used. But of course, exploitation. Jay's Mourning Warehouse. So not far from here, a warehouse entirely dedicated to outfitting your own house and your own lifestyle in all the trappings of mourning. So they would go around and cover everything with crepe, every surface, make sure there's no reflective surfaces, make sure that crepe is everywhere. In fact, Cortard's, a crepe manufacturer, in 1835, its yearly profit was £40,000 in 1835. In 1885, it was £450,000. That's because somewhere like Jay's, just like your Harrods of the day but for mourning, could produce the jewellery. They could do everything. They could make sure that the widow was taken care of. And we have so many references back to this. They would just go out. One of my favourite ones that I always reference, weepers. They would pay people to stand out the front of your door and cry. Incredible, incredible. But it's all there. Which brings us to our jet and its imitations. Now, jet, once again, if you look at jet, say death. You're wrong, I'm sorry. Unless there's an element within here which says in memory of, or a dedication to, even if it's just the giving of hair, it doesn't mean death. Just because it's black. It was popularised because of the court and because of Victoria. So it was fashionable, and they pretty much gutted Whitby, trying to get as much as they could, and that was the gold standard, by the way, Whitby jet. And so much so that in 1832, they had 2 shops employing 25 people, and by 1872, 200 shops, employing 1,500 men, women, and children. That's incredible. One of the last jet turners actually passed away in the 1950s. But it's a stunning thing. But of course everyone wants to copy it as much as possible. You can see things like vulcanite, an early form of rubber which Goodyear invested in. You could press those and produce them very quickly, and you could create more curved edges, so jet, chisel, turns, polished, vulcanite. You could create different sentiments. But of course, just because it's black doesn't mean death. We need to look at the symbolism. We need to look at the style. And vulcanite could be more voluminous and really pretty actually, but because worn on the outside, it didn't suffer from any chafing, it didn't suffer from any pulling, it was, you know, quite prominent. Beautiful, beautiful stuff. I quite like vulcanite, to be honest. I don't see it as an inferior thing. I just think it's pretty. But of course we've got bog oak. Once again, people say bog oak. Mourning, no. Irish, yes. Gifting, yes. Was it some of it for mourning? Absolutely. We need to look at them first. Just because it's black doesn't mean it is even a representation of a jet copy. It's not. It's just pretty. It's beautiful for itself. We can see French jet glass. We're not going to call it French jet though. We'll call it Vauxhall glass. Thank you very much. We're British. Take that, French. Okay, and by the end of the century, this is the style which really took over in terms of basic mourning jewels and sentimental jewels. We have this band here constructed in two parts with hairwork going all the way through in the weave. And on the top, we've got our black enamel and our pearls. This one we know because of black enamel, and it says dedicated to a father who passed away in 1888. If you change this piece out here and you turn this into a love heart, which you could do in a catalogue, and you kept your hair there, it's a love token. It's not just mourning. It was just a popular style. But here you can see it replicated exactly the same, just with different elements. In memoriam, with our beautiful pearls here, and other Victorian styles too, which are very typical. Catalogue produced, mass produced, doesn't make them any less special. There's still a life in there, so we've got to focus on that. Beautiful open weaves. You see wonderful elements of construction. You can see entire ones that open up, sometimes known as poison rings, but hidden compartments, just like that locket we saw back in 1661. Beautiful rings. But of course, by the time of the High Empire, we didn't need all of the trappings of, say, the Gothic revival. The one thing I love about that sort of High Victorian, this being 1889, it's solid, it's stayed, beautiful, clean design. It's stunning. It's a gorgeous ring. But it doesn't need to influence anymore because mourning and culture is so far ingrained in society that it's already on its way out. By about the 1880s, we start to see a decline. And part of that decline, and a reaction to it, silver. Silver became popular. So this one here, it says "From Mother" on it with a bloodstone on it. From Mother. Sentimentality started to change. People had lived with their big, bold, gold, heavy black enamels for about 30 years now. And can you imagine being stuck in the same fashion for 30 years? I can't. Well, as long as I'm teaching this, I'm sure I will be, but I love it. And I'd like to get to quickly the industry no more. So what happened? This is the Exposition Universelle at Paris, and this is 1900. So at that 1890 to 1900 stage, lots of things happened. So 1886, we've got the Tiffany setting. We've got in 1890, 90% of the world's diamonds being produced from South Africa. Cheap diamonds, the Tiffany setting, better ways to cut through technology, prong setting, pear shape, beautiful light refracting through it, gorgeous things, complete and opposite of what we've seen. White jewellery, platinum, silver, it accommodates the diamond very well, becomes beautiful, it becomes accessible. Now, here we've got new wealth. We've got oil money coming from America, and they're coming over to France and they're spending big. So you've got new designers who are coming here and showing off their stuff, and we've got American money essentially buying it and creating fashion which the women who are now turning their veils around, the younger ladies, were quite reactionary to mourning, because mourning was getting a bit tiresome. I don't want to wear black for the rest of my life just because of my family. So some turn their veils around in defiance, and this sort of leads on into women's rights and the suffragette movement. The younger set just weren't interested that much. And we have this very late piece here. By the time that this piece was produced, this is from Melbourne, in memoriam, the 11th, 1911, for Julia Little, which I've actually met her gravesite, Melbourne Cemetery. The style was an anachronism. It's just become part of the family value set, but as a thing to do, no, not so much. These jewels did exist. Were they things that we had to do in our stages of mourning? No. Did our parents, did our grandparents carry it through till they died? Yes. Not always, but yes. Because that was the tradition. But our traditions are changing. Modernism is changing. We even had the Berlin iron that was popular previously. This is for World War I. We've got icing for gold. It's all there. We still carry through a lot of the same traditions, and even there was a romantic revival during the Edwardian period. By about 1901 to 1910, they copied a lot of the Georgian jewels that were done, even miniatures. You can tell them a mile away, they're very light, but they carry that same canthus rose setting around the sides, but you might get the beautiful inlay of miniature, and some of them are contemporary, you can tell by the fashion. But it was a romantic revival period. It's not the same. It is another type of style. And then you see things like this from about the 1930s and 40s. So these Bakelite rings, really cellular with photography in them, still not part of what had come before. And we need to think about that for a second. World War I, we've got mass attrition. After that, we've got the Spanish flu. We've got a good third of the world being knocked out by 1919. And still, the mourning culture didn't get back on its feet. Modernism changed everything. Mass communication, rapid transit, people and mobility moving around the planet. Modernism in itself, how it turned into consumer goods. The giving of consumer goods started to overcome what had come as a gift of a giving of a ring. And that's very important, because those things are just as important for someone setting up a new life with a husband or a wife. And then we see things like this, which I'll just end with. We start to see jewels which, they're not actually mourning jewels, but we see sellers tailoring pieces, doctoring pieces. This piece here, this band isn't authentic. And we see a skull on top painted. And this is a replica on top with the glass. It's not real. It's not as it would have been. This would have been domed. So for the collector, we need to look at these jewels and start to wonder why they were produced. What's the ROI involved? Because I get a lot of questions about why would people still produce this jewellery today? And it's generally to make money, because then you see things like this. Oh boy, which I dislike ending on. You see these produced today, and they're mass produced and they're worth so much money. There are places in, say, Italy, which are selling these for €10,000 or more. And they go on eBay, they go online. This has nothing to do with what is part of what you've just been a part of for over an hour. This has nothing to do with memento mori. It's just a cash grab by people. There are other ones who have replicated pieces for the sake of their own care. They love those jewels. This is just about generation of money. So I like to end it on this particular one because it makes me happy. And this particular gentleman from about 1810 is wearing all black. It's a lovely thing, with the hairwork around it. And is he in mourning? Quite possibly. It's a beautiful piece, and I think what I want to leave on is just that all of these jewels represent an entire life, an entire culture, a society, a religion, politics, economics. They're not just a jewel. It would take me about one sentence to explain what that ring meant. But if I told you why it was produced, how it was produced, what were the reasons of it being produced, and what would be the family context of wearing it, then it means something more. And then it becomes living history. Because what we want to do, like I mentioned, is carry forth the memory of these jewels, not just the person, but the jewellery itself. We want to take that into our hearts and remember these pieces were cared for and loved. They were given out at funerals. They were the content of someone's hair. That was what they had to remember them by. They didn't have photography. They didn't have the things like instant gratification we have today. They have one element, that sense memory, to capture that one person for the rest of their natural lives. And here they've carried through to today, and we still talk about them and still venerate them in a beautiful, beautiful way. So what I want everyone to do is to appreciate this jewellery, to carry forth the knowledge that at least I hope I've shared with you today, and to reflect that and sit down with these pieces and appreciate just their very beauty. Look at the year with which they were made. Look at their hallmarks. Look at their inscription. And think of that value system of that particular time and share that with all your family and friends and show just how important these jewels are. They're more important than any photograph you'll ever find. This is living history. And on that note, well, the links are not good, but please, if you want to support my little cause of teaching this for the rest of my life, go to patreon.com/Art of Mourning. I'm doing curated videos. I'll be doing evaluations. I'll be doing weekly videos hopefully soon. I've just done a lot of video recently and content. I'm happy to do anything specifically for anyone who wants me to do a piece on a particular ring. And my Threadless page if you want t-shirts, tote bags and all the rest of it. Each one of those keeps the lights on. And thank you very much.